of faith, my friend. A head that's filled with knowledge soon is too bloated with its own weight to fit through heaven's gate. So think with your heart, it's the only organ for salvation. Think with your heart, don't deduce yourself to eternal damnation. Think with your heart, 'cause you know that the Almighty sees us. Think only with your heart. Whoever heard of the bleeding brain of Jesus? Think only with your heart.
I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with sense, reason, and intellect has intended us to forego their use.
Happy heresies, and welcome to the desert of the real. Welcome to the machine, my son, and the means to escape it, as you arrive like you do every week to Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, always broadcast at the virtual Alexandria through the godabovegod.com. There must be some way out of here, said the Joker to the thief, and you are about to find it. Always shying away from scholarly pontification, and certainly shying away from New Age ejaculation. Forever in the sensible razor's edge that is the middle path of Siddhartha, Hermes thrice great, and Alice in her adventures in Wonderland.
But I don't want to go among mad people.
We don't take prisoners but liberate them here at Aeon Byte. We are not the final authority on anything, but hope to be an endless possibility for everything. We simply disseminate the forbidden fruit of knowledge, and what you do with it is your own darn business. Whatever works for you, just make sure it works. But don't violate anyone's human rights with this information, or we'll be forced to
release the Kraken
on your ass. We are not here to make a better world, but better inner worlds, so you can find the mystery that works for you and only you. Forget about leaving a better world when you check out with the Joker and the Thief. How about a more interesting world? Forget about being the change you want to see in the world. Just be the strange you want to see in the world. You are not a beautiful or unique snowflake. You're the same decaying organic matter as everything else. However, you are the all-singing, all-dancing crap of the world, borrowing from the Gnostic gospel known as Fight Club.
How's that working out for you? What? Being clever?
So always write your own gospel and live your own myth. Allow yourself to be more than you've allowed yourself to be in countless lifetimes. Oscar Wilde said we are all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at stars. Reach for those stars. And then go higher than the stars, because they rule your fate, or they think they do. Be completely liberated and full of dream stuffy stuff, regardless of what the paralyzing Medusa called society told you, regardless of how your parents shame you, regardless of how the average mocked you, because they crave for the divine spark that is your talent and curiosity.
Our fathers were models for God. If our fathers bailed, what does that tell you about God?
And your dreams and potential, of course. They wanted you to be told what to dream, as you were welcomed into the machine. As the Nag Hammadi Library's concept of great power says, yet you are sleeping, dreaming dreams. Wake up and return. Taste and eat the true food. Hand out the word and the water of life.
You mustn't be afraid to dream a little bigger, darling.
The truth shall set you free, but first it must break your heart. Force down a herd of red pills down your throat. On this June 16th, the year of our demiurge 2012, the process continues as we have the great pleasure of being joined by Dr. Richard Carrier. He manifests himself to our eternal agora to discuss one of the greatest and unfinished sagas in the anal annals of modern civilization, the quest for the historical Jesus. Whoa. First, though, please allow me to introduce myself. I am Abraxas, that terrible god above God as the ancients knew him. the missing 8th sermon to the dead, the self-replicating eternal soundtrack of the counterculture, the seal that guarded the treasures of the Knights Templar and sealed their fate in the end.
Every time I try to talk to someone, it's sorry this and forgive me that and I'm not worthy.
I come to you in one of his mortal incarnations, his most pathetic one actually, as Miguel Connor, somewhere in the lawful and frigid dystopia that is Chicago, patiently waiting for the beginning of the world.
You created me. I didn't create some loser alter ego to make myself feel better.
Thus I call upon you to open your eyes from the waking sleep Gurdjieff spoke about, lest the machine swallow you whole. I call upon you Gnostics, lovers of the esoterica, and Dionysian freethinkers. I call upon you Johnny Cash Bodhisattvas, 21st century schizoid men, and existentialist Galahads who know there is no holy grail, but just don't give a shiitake mushroom anymore. Shiny windmills are nice and strange. It's all fun and games until someone loses a third eye. Then it's just bloody fun. We'll get over our Xanax withdrawals, overcome our best Ritalin Prometheus, and stop playing the drama queen Medea to the Prozac Nation Argonauts with their false medicated promises. We will never surrender and never quit because we're tired of being lied to. We're tired of dancing with ourselves. We're tired of pretending a middle class ever existed. We're tired of oppression, repression, and the Great Depression that is our lives. Mostly, we're just tired of being tired.
I know we're all pretty small in the big scheme of things, and I suppose the most you can hope for is to make some kind of difference. But what kind of difference have I made? What in the world is better because of me?
Are you with me? Are you ready to go down Fascination Street? I mean, the meek will inherit the earth, right? But it's only blazing souls like you and me that will make sure they keep it. Without a doubt, Richard Carrier is one of those souls. Again, he arrives to Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio to fornicate some sanity into the Arkham Asylum that has become the quest for the historical Jesus Christ.
The Buddha figure is like that of the Christ. Of course, 500 years earlier, you could match those two traditions right down the line, even to the characters of their apostles or their monks.
And this is surrounding Dr. Carrier's latest book, Proving History, Bayes' Theorem, and the Quest for the Historical Jesus. This book is just the electric shock therapy both academia and laymen, or something like that, need so desperately in this world of corporate misinformation, Mickey Mouse blogs, and the holy blood / holy grail social networking.
Yeah, man, I'll tell you what, that dang old internet, man, you just go on there and point and click, get in there, talk about www.com, you got them naked chicks on there, man, you go click, 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 it's real easy, man.
Our interview will reveal this and much more. Certainly check out Dr. Carrier's other works, Not the Impossible Faith, Sense and Goodness Without God, and Why I'm Not a Christian. And certainly check out his website, Richard Carrier with 2 R's, .info. It's preggers with cracking articles and links that if it doesn't set you free, at least will remind you that you are shackled to stone with the vultures of your insecurity, hovering over for the mind kill.
We are to extricate the truth from this unbeliever on pain of torture!
You see, my beloved truth seekers, a large part of scholarship agrees that the Jesus of the Bible is a composite of myth, theology, and historical evidence. Yet the process of separating these three has left academia with contesting theories and a rickety foundation because of faulty mythologies. On the other hand, sensationalism and fundamentalism have created its own mansion industry of competing Christs.
I like to picture Jesus in a tuxedo t-shirt because it says like, I want to be formal, but I'm here to party too. Because I like to party, so I like my Jesus to party.
The quest for Jesus, unless you need your brakes changed, seems without an end. However, Carrier's Proving History contends there are logical and mathematical tools that can not only forge a consensus, but unify many of the various Jesus theories. Beyond that, in our interview and in his book Proving History, we shall investigate the modern quest for the historical Jesus and the origins of Christianity itself. In the end, we discover little history, but an ocean of mythology from the imagination of ancient man.
Yea, and God said to Abraham, "You will kill your son Isaac." And Abraham said, "I can't hear you. You'll have to speak into the microphone." And God said, "Oh, I'm sorry. Is this better? Check, check, check. Jerry, pull the high end out. I'm still getting some hiss back here."
Nothing wrong with that, I say. Our archive of past shows has its own Jesus section. It cages the many rising/dying godmen theories in many ways. You've got the Astral theological Jesus, Jesus in India, Jesus the Essene, Jesus the revolutionary, Jesus the shill of Rome, Jesus the shill of Buddha, Raptor Jesus, oh my, Jesus Christ Superstar. When did you become such a projection to our deepest, innermost fears and hopes and insights and nightmares? The Gnostic Spigot would say, since forever, since before Christ, since we needed a savior but were too proud to admit it, as our collective ego calcified within unforgiving history.
Those things outside are just vessels. They're possessed. The weakest willed are the easiest to turn.
Possessed by what? Demons?
No. By angels.
The Gnostic Gospel seemed to be some sort of deep therapy for its writers, showcasing various degrees of Jesus, from fleshy to ethereal, from dogmatic to consoling, from being called Jesus to some other name like Seth, Melchizedek, Dositheus, and some other hierophant of mysteries.
Have I ever let us down? How far have you come because of me?
And indeed, unraveling the mysteries of the cosmos is the Gnostic revealer's primary role in the so-called Gnostic Gospels. I've pontificated much in past shows about this and the freedom that is the flight into the skies of mythopoeia. But in the end, being the strange we want to see in the world, maybe we should just all defer to the wisdom of Dire Straits in their song Industrial Disease, which says, two men say they're Jesus, one of them must be wrong.
But you will fail, Nazarene, as you have always failed.
But since this show is called Aeon Byte, and I know they will bite me unless I do their bidding, let me stick for a bit to Gnostic philosophy. I will quote Robert Price, who superbly summarizes the Gnostic ethos in an article he wrote for the Gnostic Journal concerning the Gospel of Juan. It's a bit drab, but you can always put on a Matrix or Neon Genesis Evangelion or his Dark Majesty series backdrop if you want to make it sexier. Your mileage may vary. The red pill goes down the same no matter what flavor you lather its gel caps with.
Why, oh why didn't I take the blue pill?
Here it is. There is an anti-cosmic dualism. The world is considered as absolutely evil, irredeemable, and under the despotic control of evil powers and demons. Certain individuals may be saved from this veil of tears. They are the rare ones who harbor a true soul or spark of the divine light. To them God has sent a redeemer or revealer, who saves them by revealing to them hitherto unsuspected facts of their heavenly identity. Knowing who they truly are, destined for better things, they will be able to slough off the gross body at death and ascend to heaven. This is basically the soteriology of Gnosticism.
Once again, things that could have been brought to my attention yesterday!
Conjoined with it was usually a set of doctrines seeking to explain how things had come to pass. This was the Gnostic theodicy. According to it, the world was evil because matter is inherently evil, and the material world could not have been created by a good God, and thus was the work of an insane and incompetent demiurge, identified with the Old Testament Jehovah.
I am the architect. I created the Matrix. I've been waiting for you.
Yes, there is more, like the emanating pleroma theology with its aeons and luminaries, culminating with the hysterical Sophia. There are dimensions of light and nasty titans hidden below hell itself. Gnosticism always having that sci-fi sensibility, as Eric Davis explained in a past interview. There are history's first depth psychologists, according to Carl Jung, some of history's greatest artists and history's unknown masters of parody, as other scholars and guests have demonstrated. And in the tradition of Dr. Carrier and the New Atheist dispensation, one of history's earliest and sharpest skeptics, as many other guests and scholars have also contended. The proof is in the pudding, my beloved truth seekers. If you can't handle Jehovah's meat, how can you have Sophia's pudding?
I can't imagine you with all your complexity, all your perfection, all your imperfection. Look at you. You're just a shade. You're just a shade of my real wife. And you were the best that I could do, but I'm sorry, you're just not good enough.
I mean, if the classic Gnostics distrusted reality and their own monkey brains, how do you think they took everything else, even their own savior? The classic Gnostics are long gone, except maybe with the Mandeans. There are no Hellenistic Gnostics left, really. But we can continue that tradition of depth psychology, parody, wild mysticism, and, yes, skepticism.
Don't you see? It's not about you. It's about them.
But I can't go back.
Don't know that you got a choice, son. No man can walk out on his own story.
Reason and irrationality were the tools of these heretics of a bygone era. Nothing rational about poetry, nothing irrational about hard Platonic philosophy. They made it work, my beloved truth seekers, although the machine made history work against them. Alan Moore did write that all history is fiction. Furthermore, it was a fierce skeptic, yet wild mystic named John Lennon who said, "The more real you get, the more unreal the world gets." Whatever works for you, just make sure it works.
I didn't come here to tell you how this is going to end. I came here to tell you how it's going to begin.
Richard Carrier's Proving History makes the quest for a historical Jesus work again. It's throbbing rich with logic and math, but just as throbbing rich with mythology and common sense. Two sides of the same coin, if you stop giving it to the Caesar establishment. But enough of my drivel. Let us to the interview with Dr. Richard Carrier. Yes, heresy shouldn't be this much fun. But it just is. It just is.
The Lord of Hosts, the stranger from the manger, the hardest working man in the Astral. Give it up for Jesus!
This is the Aeon Byte interview. With us, we have the pleasure of having Dr. Richard Carrier to discuss his new book, Proving History, Bayes' Theorem, and the quest for the historical Jesus, and hopefully other heresies. How are you doing today, Dr. Carrier?
I'm doing great, thanks.
Well, thank you for joining us again. In your book, Proving History, you write that modern biblical scholarship has a problem based on several faulty premises. What exactly is the problem with modern biblical scholarship?
Well, it's not the whole of biblical scholarship, of course. It's mainly Jesus studies, and it's mainly the quest for the historical Jesus that's become haywire. And I'm not actually the first to point this out. I mean, every expert who has actually examined the methodology of the field has come to the same conclusion, that the methodology is invalid. It doesn't work. It's based on invalid inferences or based on bad application. And I document this. I cite the scholars who pointed this out in the first chapter of the book. And it basically means that they don't have a valid method because no one has replaced it. So essentially, in their attempt to try and ascertain the historical Jesus, what we can know about the historical Jesus, they've been using a completely defunct method, a method that doesn't work. Now that it's been pointed out and it's been demonstrated, no one has replaced it. So we don't have a method now. So what we need to do is we need to develop a new method, one that works, one that's logically valid, and then apply that to the evidence and then see what we get. And that's what my book does. My book does both things. It expands on what the scholars who have analyzed the methods have previously done and shows why all the methods are invalid in detail, and then proposes a method to replace it, which is a modified form, a basic form of Bayes' theorem. Just basically a Bayesian thinking is a way to approach it, which is a method that historians can use to debate and actually make progress on conclusions in history, especially when there are disputes over certain matters. And I think that's the way to go forward, and that's what the book argues.
Before we get into Bayes' theorem, there is one thing that most, you might say, secular scholarship does agree on, and that is that Jesus was a historical, small-time, unknown religious leader whose zealot followers promoted his message and then splintered into different sects. That's basically where we are right now, beyond
That's
the
right.
Jesus a space alien, Jesus a cynic, Jesus you've seen.
Yeah.
And why do you think, one thing I was thinking today is that if there's one place that secular and religious, even atheists and theists will circle the wagons around, is on the mythicist position. Why are they so antagonistic towards it?
Yeah. It's kind of a bit irrational, although it's explicable because there have been so many such bad arguments for mythicism. Some of it's just outright crank, very conspiracy theory based, and gets a lot of facts wrong and is misleading. And I think a lot of people get sick of that. They get burned by it or they get annoyed by it, and so they're reacting emotionally to the lousy mythicism out there, rather than focusing on, well, is there a non-lousy case to be made for this? Is there a way that we can actually look at it in a more objective sense that isn't emotionally charged and isn't based on conspiracy theories and all of that? I think that's what we need to do. And when I started looking at the evidence, I started to realize it's a better case to be made. And so the historicists, the people who maintain the historicity of Jesus, are being too certain. Their certainty is ill-founded. They don't have the kind of evidence they would really need to be that confident in their position. And I think we need a new look at it. And I'm nearly finished with my next book, which will be on the historicity of Jesus Christ, which will be out next year, where I do make that. I make a proper, formal, scholarly case for Jesus didn't exist. And I do it in the correct way, the way that scholars can look at and respect and treat as a proper scholarly argument. And I don't know where it'll go from there. Maybe it'll get refuted. Maybe it'll get confirmed. I don't know. But at least then we'll have a proper scholarly argument for it that isn't based on specious reasoning or excess speculation and so on.
There's certainly a lot you bring about in your book about how scholars have gotten, just like you said, all over the place with the Jesus theory. For example, you have the embarrassment criterion, which says, well, if Mark had to say these things that were sort of embarrassing about Jesus, then they must be true. But as you point out, what's embarrassing to us wasn't embarrassing to Mark, right?
Yes, and there are actually a lot of problems with that. In fact, I spend the most time and the most pages on that because it is so commonly used and because there are so many things wrong with it, that particular argument. But one obvious, refutation is to find counterexamples. And then, for example, at the same time the Christians were evangelizing their religion, there was another cult evangelizing its religion called the cult of Attis. And it was Attis and Sybil. And Attis was basically a son of God, who had, died, and this is part of their myth, but he had died by castrating himself. Emasculation, self-castration, was one of the most disgusting, embarrassing things for the educated elite of the time. They really looked down their noses on this as like, this is the most absurd thing that you could possibly worship as a castrated god. And yet they were preaching it, and it was successful. So you can't really argue that, well, it's embarrassing to go around preaching a castrated god, therefore they can't have made it up, therefore there must have actually been an Attis who actually castrated himself. The argument doesn't work, right? It's clearly they had some other reason for promoting this belief that overrode all the instincts against it and all the hostility to it. And there are a lot of religions like that. They often start promoting ideas that aren't the ideas they have to promote. I mean, the Trinity is an example. Quite frankly, there are theologies of Jesus and God that would make much more sense and be far easier to defend and would be just as successful in maintaining Christian salvation belief, like the actual beliefs that Paul defends, for example. Paul's not defending a Trinity. Paul's version of Christianity makes much more sense. But once the dogma was chosen that we're going to defend the Trinity, well, now they were invested in it. So they were really promoting it, and the church has been promoting it ever since. And would suppress anyone who would suggest, this doesn't make any sense, right? They would actually, they actually go out and kill these people once they had the power to do it. But that demonstrates that things that are embarrassing or nonsensical can easily become core dogmas of a church, even though they're not true. And so there are a lot of examples like that.
Another thing which I found great, and sometimes it's a great book, but you have some great singers. For example, another one which scholars love to use is the whole thing about Aramaic substratums or stratums or whatever. But as you say, it almost seems that scholars believe that the only person who spoke Aramaic in ancient times was Jesus. So if there's some Aramaic, that's it, Jesus existed.
Yeah, or even not necessarily even that. They'll just assume that if it's Aramaic, therefore it dates from the 30s and comes from Palestine. That's an invalid inference as well. There were Aramaic speakers throughout Syria and even in Egypt, and for centuries. I mean, so you can't really date it to like the 30s. It was, this was an eyewitness account because it was in Aramaic. The bigger problem with that is not just that we can't even identify that an Aramaic source is any more honest or accurate or true than a non-Aramaic source. The bigger problem is that we don't have the Aramaic sources. So to say that you could say that, well, there might be an underlying Aramaic source to a particular passage in Mark, for example, tells you nothing about what that Aramaic source said. And that's a key thing that I think gets forgotten in this whole debate, because you could have an Aramaic source that says, "Let me tell you a parable about Jesus," and so the Aramaic text is explicitly telling you that it's not a true story. If you erase that part and just include the story part of it, well, now you're going to reconstruct that document and say, "Oh, look, it's a story about Jesus. It's a narrative. It must come from an eyewitness." So it's very crucial that we understand what the context was of the original document. What was actually in the original document? What did it actually say? What did it actually claim? For example, if you look at the book of Revelation in the New Testament, that entire thing is a conversation or has several conversations with Jesus. But Jesus is dead, right? This is a weird deified Jesus in outer space, right? That this guy's having a hallucinatory conversation with. Now, if you were to strip that part of the explanation off, where it's, and I saw in a dream, or I had a revelation, and this is what Jesus told me. If you take that part off and just include the sayings, well, now, then you go and insert those sayings into history. Well, now the original source would have told you that these were revelations, but now the new source, the one that's copying from it, is telling you that they're in history. So you can't really argue for the historicity of Jesus using a document that we don't have, because we don't know what that document said.
Exactly. And what's fascinating, you point out very logically, they're falling down trying to figure out why Jesus used Psalm 21, and you show it's an allegory of death and rebirth and so forth. But Mark himself says, look, I'm writing to a secret organization. I'm using irony. This is all sort of a secret club, and you guys don't get it.
Yeah. There's a verse in I think chapter 4 of Mark where he has Jesus say, it's like, to outsiders I speak everything in parables, so they don't know the truth. But to you, I'll tell you the true meaning of the parables. And that in and of itself is a little coded thing. It's a little parable explaining to the reader that there is an external meaning, an esoteric meaning, what they call an exoteric meaning, an exoteric meaning, which is the meaning for outsiders. So you read the Gospel of Mark just as it is. The superficial meaning is a narrative about Jesus in the time of Pilate. But the esoteric meaning, the secret meaning, are all the symbolic points that are being made, what those events symbolize and represent. And that would be the secret part of the teaching. So when you have that kind of multi-layered discourse, you have a difficulty trying to reconstruct what really happened. And we have an example in Origen. Origen is a Christian apologist who wrote in the 3rd century AD. And he kind of gives away the game, because he actually explains this in detail. He says, there's a version of the gospel that we tell outsiders, and then and we tell what he calls, children in the church, basically lower ranking members of the church. And then there's a doctrine for more advanced members of the church who are more mature and can handle the truth, And the true doctrine, the stuff that's for advanced people, is always allegorical and more celestial and more metaphysical. It's not historical facts. The things that they tell the public are the historical facts. And one of the examples he gives is the resurrection, where he says, the true story is that Jesus left the corpse behind and rose in a completely new body that was completely unlike a normal human body and was a superior body. And the corpse is not relevant, and it's still sitting in the grave, basically, is that he doesn't explicitly put it in those terms, but he does say very clearly that the flesh, the body of flesh that Jesus died in, is like the placenta. It's just sloughed off and left behind, and then the superior body rises, and that's the resurrection body. And he says, well, that's what we tell advanced people, but the ordinary laymen of the church, they need to believe in the literal resurrection of the flesh because they'll freak out if we try to explain them this advanced teaching. And so he talks about interpreting passages. You can interpret it as a fleshly resurrection, and that's what we tell the layman. But this is what we tell more advanced people. It's really an allegory for this more supernatural resurrection. And he gives other examples like that. So we know this kind of discourse existed, and the pagans talk about it too. They did it as well. There's the cult of Osiris. Plutarch tells us that the cult of Osiris, the priests will tell the public and the lower members of the church, they'll say, Osiris was a king who lived at a certain point of time in Egypt, and these are the things that happened to him here on earth. But among each other, what they say is that this is all an allegory for what really happens, and what really happens is that Osiris is a god in outer space, and he descends just below the moon in outer space, and there he dies and resurrects. And so he was never on Earth, he was never a king, he was never a historical person in our sense. He was always this outer space being. And so that's the secret doctrine, or the esoteric, sorry, getting that right, yeah, the esoteric doctrine. And then the exoteric doctrine is the earthly biography, right? So it's entirely possible that Christianity began this way.
Exactly, and even as you point out, it seems Mark, and because of his low Christology, he seems to be making Jesus into basically a Homeric hero. And I've read some of your articles, we both really love the work of Dennis MacDonald.
Yeah, he's made some good points. And I think he's right that there is a lot of Homeric parallelism going on there. It's what he would call transvaluation, where Homer was a very revered school text, and it was kind of like, it was their equivalent, the pagan equivalent of the Bible. Like
it was scripture to Hellenize.
You get your morals by citing examples from Homer. But of course, Homer by that time had become kind of embarrassing morally, in the same way that the Bible now is embarrassing morally, because there's like horrible things that are promoted in the Bible that completely disagree with modern moral values. And that had happened in antiquity. The Homer's epics were also now in conflict with more advanced moral values of even then, after the philosophers had really improved moral thinking in these regards. And so you look at Homer, and so there were different ways of interpreting it and looking at Homer and trying to come up with ways to reinterpret it so that it isn't taken literally and promoting incest or whatever the case may be, or adultery, the case may be. We have an example of what the Roman author Virgil did. And Virgil said, Homer is this kind of like this scripture for our moral values and stuff from the Greeks, but Romans disagree with those values. So I'm going to make a new Homer, and he called it the Aeneid. And it's about, he picks one character in Homer's epics that is a mythical ancestor of the Romans, Aeneas, and he has this sort of a version of the Odyssey, except it's Aeneas and Aeneas's journey all the way home from the Trojan War. And basically he takes a lot of stories in Homer and rewrites them so that they promote Roman values rather than the original values of Homer. And that's called transvaluation, where you take an original story, you put enough clues in it so you can kind of tell what story he's riffing on, but then he changes some things, and that's the point, right? Is when you see the change, now you know what his message is. He's saying, he's saying that we don't believe in that original story's values. This is the values that we want to promote, or this is the message we want to promote. So part of that, it's not going to be a direct parallel. It's not going to be exact copy. It's actually going to be deliberately changed, and it's the changes that actually communicate the meaning of the story, the importance of the story. And this is what Mark does. This is what Dennis MacDonald shows that Mark does for a lot of stories in Homer, where he sometimes borrows motifs and uses them as direct parallels to communicate things because readers would be familiar with them. But sometimes he takes them and then he changes something to sort of reverse the moral values, reverse the message of it, to basically communicate that Christian values are superior to to Greco-Roman values, right? There are various examples. Mark isn't the only one who does this. Luke does this as well. One of the wow. MacDonald's last book on this took examples from the book of Acts. He has several examples he finds in the book of Acts. But there are other examples, not necessarily from Homer, but in Luke, where Luke takes Roman national myths and reverses them. And one of them, for example, is the Romulus tale. And Romulus was basically, he's a celestial god who was born to a virgin, became incarnate, and lived as a lowly shepherd, and basically rose to become a king and founded Rome. And then the Senate conspired to kill him, and then his body vanishes and people flee, and there's darkness over the earth. And then he's resurrected in a new glorious body, and he visits his friend on the road to basically say, yes, he tells the whole story. It's like, yes, I was an incarnate God. I came down to found a kingdom, and now I have to ascend back to heaven. And if you follow my rules, you will have a great kingdom forever. And this was there was a passion play based on this. It was acted out in Rome every year, possibly other cities as well, where people would actually act out this drama of Romulus dying and resurrecting and so on. And we have discussions of this ceremony. But when we see in Luke, when we have the Emmaus narrative, when some of the disciples after the death of Jesus are on the road to Emmaus, they have an experience that's very similar to Romulus's appearance to Proculus, which was the original in the Roman story. It's very similar to it, but Luke has changed elements of it. For example, in the Roman story, Romulus has a fantastic, glorious, gigantic new body, right? He's like now he looks like a god, In the Christian version, they've reversed it. Luke has reversed it into a hidden God narrative. And this is another kind of common motif, which is the idea that angels and gods might come and visit you and pretending to be ordinary people in order to test you. So this was the idea of the hidden God motif is common. And so Luke took this glorious return of Romulus story and reversed it into a hidden God story where Jesus appears and they don't recognize him. They don't know who he is until he's, basically told them all the instructions, or he's related basically the scriptures and so forth until they're convinced, and then they realize, oh, this must be Jesus, and then he vanishes. And that's the story. But there are many other parallels in the story that kind of line this up with the Romulus tale. But it's the things that Luke has changed that are actually kind of the point, that are actually the things that Luke wants to say.
And Dr. Carrier, just a few questions for the record before we get into the main event. You don't have a problem with Mark and priority. It seems that's where the scholars are pretty much probably right, if you would.
Yes. Of all the Gospels we have, Mark does appear to be the earliest. The evidence is best explained that way. That's for sure.
And going a little to the mythicists, talked about some of their faulty arguments. You show Romulus is a big one that most mythicists miss, but the one that they are hung up on is Mithras, and you reveal that we can't make that assumption.
I mean, yeah, Mithras is often portrayed as a dying and rising god who was born on December 25th to a virgin and so on. But we actually don't know most of those things. Even the birthday of Mithras is difficult to pin down as to when it was assigned to the 25th of December. It was eventually, but even Jesus wasn't originally born on December 25th. That was a later development. And it was borrowed from pagans, but it's probably borrowed from Sol Invictus, the worship of the sun. It was a sun cult. And it was borrowed 3rd, 4th century, long after the origins of Christianity. So December 25th is a red herring. That's not even a relevant parallel. If you want to explain the origins of Christianity, you have to look at what Christianity looked like when it actually originated, and then look for parallels and precedents to that. And that's a different task. Mithras was not a dying and rising god. As far as we can tell, he doesn't die, but he does undergo a passion. He undergoes some sort of great struggle or suffering through which he obtains victory over death. And therefore, if you worship Mithras, you also will share in his victory over death. So there is a parallel there. You have this suffering that he undergoes. He achieves victory over death by it, and then worshippers of him, followers of him, will share in that victory. And that's the same story that the Christians tell, right? Except in their story, the suffering is not just, enduring horrible things, but also dying. Jesus dies. But we also have examples of dying and rising gods. Romulus is one, Osiris is another, Zalmoxis is another, Inanna is another. There are clear examples of pre-Christian dying and rising gods. But there are also gods that are similar, have similar stories, but don't actually die. And Mithras is one of them. We don't have any evidence that Mithras ever died in his myth.
Speaking of rising and dying godmen, to continue, where do you stand on Paul's epistles? That's another great battleground, and I'm using a little histrionics here, between the historicists and the mythicists, and I like to call the mythicists Dohertians for Earl Doherty. Where do you stand on the issue of Paul's silence?
Yeah, I think it is very suspicious. I think the attempts of historicists to explain it away are very specious in many respects. and I think are desperate. I think it's very odd, the silences in Paul's letters. Now, there are a few passages in Paul's letters that could be interpreted as supporting historicity. They're very few, and they're very ambiguous. And that's the real problem. What's really strange is the things that you would expect him to mention, but never does. I mean, the one thing it's often overlooked, for example, is that never in any of the 7 authentic letters of Paul does he ever once mention anyone ever seeing Jesus before he died. When you look at his description of the gospel, where he says, what I received by revelation from Jesus, he says he received it by revelation in Galatians. When he relates that gospel in 1 Corinthians, he says, this is what I received. He says Jesus died for our sins and was resurrected on the 3rd day, and then he appeared to Peter and so on, and goes down the list of the people who saw him. Notably, conspicuously absent from that gospel is Jesus appearing to anyone before he died. People only see Jesus after his death. He only comes to them after his death. And that's really weird. There's no mention of Jesus having a ministry. There's no mention of Jesus having disciples. There's no mention of Jesus ever having been on earth in any clear sense, of anyone having met him or having talked to him or any of that. That's strange. I mean, when you look at it, you basically have 7 letters. I think it's something like 20,000 words or something. If you're going to write 7 obsessive letters where almost everything you're talking about is Jesus, and you never once actually talk about Jesus, that's weird. But I mean, if you think of it like now, if you were to say you were worshiping, Reverend Moon, for example, and Reverend Moon is an actual guy, and you wrote basically 20,000 words, to your cult about, like, this is why we worship Reverend Moon. This is why you should follow these are what Reverend Moon teaches. This is why you should follow these teachings. This is why, he's basically resolving arguments in the church by appealing to scriptures and things like that. And you're always talking about Reverend Moon and the whole thing, but you never once actually mention anything Reverend Moon did. And you never actually talk about where or when he said certain things, or even you don't even get into disputes about what he said or anything like that. And it would be very strange, and I think that needs to be acknowledged as strange. Having said that, there are some passages that they can hang on. For example, there are 2 passages where Paul mentions brothers of the Lord, and it's sometimes assumed that that proves that Jesus must have actually existed if he had brothers. But the problem with those passages is that the term brother of the Lord is ambiguous. It can mean adopted brother of the Lord, as all Christians were, or it can mean, biological brother of Jesus. But of course, it doesn't say brother of Jesus. It says brother of the Lord, and that's a much more cultic title. So I think those passages are ambiguous and therefore don't decide the matter.
But mentioning Cephas and James doesn't seem very ambiguous, does it?
No, those guys existed. At least they almost certainly did, because Paul talks about meeting them and talking to them. Yeah, so, but the thing is, he never calls them disciples. He says they're apostles like him. And when he talks about what makes an apostle is someone who saw the Lord. He says, that's the defining characteristic of an apostle. And when he gives the list of appearances of Jesus, he's talking about post-mortem revelations of Jesus. And that makes you an apostle. So there's no reference to Peter and James being chosen by Jesus before he died. That's never mentioned in Paul. Paul never talks about anything like that.
You don't take it as radically sometimes as Robert Price has posited that perhaps even Paul is sort of a fictional character, the shill of Marcion, perhaps.
Yeah, I find that extremely unlikely. Let's just put it that way.
So basically Paul was taking a sort of Philo of Alexandria metaphorical religion. Philo, doesn't he talk about a Joshua or Melchizedek ruling in some dimension and so forth?
Yes, Philo actually, and I talk about this in Not the Impossible Faith. I can't remember the page number 250, somewhere around there. And we have passages in Philo where he's very clear about this. Now, Philo was a Jewish theologian between the 20s and 40s, basically between 20 and 40 AD, so roughly the time when Jesus would have been alive. And he's writing basically before Paul, essentially. And Philo, in one of his, and he wrote tons of stuff. It would have, like, my complete works of Philo is 900 pages of multi-column small type. Oh. So it's we have and that's just the stuff we have. A lot of his stuff didn't survive. So, dude wrote a lot. And at one point in one of his commentaries, he talks about this particular being named Jesus, who is basically the firstborn son of God, who was created before Adam and was the agent of creation, that God used this divine being to create. And so this firstborn son of God is also called the Logos. So it's the same thing we find in the Gospel of John, for example. He's also called the high priest of God's temple in heaven, just like the book of Hebrews says in the New Testament Jesus was. So there's a lot of parallels. It looks like the same guy. We've got a firstborn son of God named Jesus living in heaven, who's the high priest of the celestial temple and the agent of creation and a pre-existent being and all of that stuff, which we also find in Paul, except for the high priest. He doesn't call him high priest, but we have that in the book of Hebrews. So this being does seem to be a pre-Christian Jewish concept of sort of an archangel. I think Philo even specifically says he's an archangel and identifies this Jesus as an archangel. Who did live up in outer space and was an agent of God's. What's unique in the Christian teaching, what we find in Paul, and of course what Paul sees as sort of the novel gospel that sort of separated Christians from other Jews, was this idea that this Jesus being, this celestial Jesus figure, descended and underwent a death and resurrection, and through that basically erased all sins forever. And it was sort of like the final, ultimate atonement sacrifice, and therefore if you attach yourself to Jesus, you can also have victory over death too, and victory over sin, just like the other mystery cults would grant to you. That seems to be the culmination idea, and I think Paul, there's two possibilities. Either Paul genuinely believed this, that he genuinely thought that he was having conversations with this celestial Jesus figure, and through hallucination or dream interpretation or whatever, or he was pretending to in order to promote a particular social gospel, that he had a particular idea of how society should run itself. The only and best way to promote an idea like that is to say God told you it was right. So that would be the way to sell it. So it's possible that Paul had more, more belief and more faith in the social model and was willing to suffer for that, and therefore was willing to tell these lies to promote it. Or he was a schizotypal, and we know many cults throughout history where there are members, and especially leaders, who are like this, who have hallucinations and have visions and have conversations with deities, and then become leaders within these cult movements. And so it's possible that he was actually, hallucinating experiences with Jesus, and actually genuinely believing that it was real, and therefore promoting it. And either scenario fits the evidence.
And moving on to the main event. What is Bayes' theorem, and how can it create a framework for biblical scholarship to move forward?
Bayes' theorem is basically, the simplest way to put it is that it's a mathematical model for all valid empirical reasoning. It's all valid empirical reasoning, and I make this argument in the book. I think anytime you're making any kind of argument that's an empirical argument rather than an a priori argument, like a logical proof is a different thing from making an argument from evidence to a conclusion. But anytime you're making an empirical argument, if your argument is valid, it's Bayesian, even if you don't know it, even if you don't realize that you're making a Bayesian argument, it is. And so if you understand how all correct reasoning works, you understand the mathematical theory that describes it, you can make use of that fact to eliminate bad arguments, to avoid bad arguments, and focus only on the best way to argue for a conclusion or to test a hypothesis against the evidence. And once you understand that, then you the world is open to you. The world is your oyster. You can do all kinds of things with it. And the trick is figuring out how to understand how the theorem works, how it correctly describes empirical reasoning, and how to make use of that when you don't have vast quantities of scientifically precise data. And that's the challenge for historians. It's always been the case for historians, is that they don't have the kind of data that scientists have. And consequently, conclusions in history are always much less certain than scientific conclusions, with some exceptions. But for the ancient world, there are very few exceptions.
As you pointed out, historians might go, well, I'm not a scientist. Why do I need all this math? But as you just said, we all think that way mathematically. For example, if a friend comes to me and says, dude, I picked up 3 chicks last night, the first thing my mind does is like the matrix numbers. I'm already thinking in math, even though I don't know I'm thinking in math, right?
Yeah, right.
Or as you use in your book, the 3 hours in Mark.
Yeah, you're immediately going to prior probability, right? You're saying that has a really low
No way.
So, and the only way to overcome a low prior probability is to have a very divergent consequent probabilities. So that's where you have the probability of the evidence has to be very low on any other explanation except that the theory is, or the claim is true. And when you look at the model, you can see how that actually works and how you're actually normally thinking that way anyway, even when you don't realize it. And I point that out and discuss it in the book. And it doesn't really require much math. Frankly, most of the time you're doing it, you don't need to do any math at all. You just do it intuitively. And even when you use the math, it's 6th grade math. It's no more advanced than that. So it's very simple stuff.
there is no reason for this not to be used. I mean, this is pretty much as black and white as we're going to get.
Yeah, that's true. And of course, but there's a lot of pushback against it, right? And in the book, I deal with all the objections that people usually raise. Like, what about this? What about that? But it wouldn't work because, and so on. And I deal with all of that in the book. And when you get through that, you'll start to realize how powerful and useful this theory actually is. And I think that's really the secret to it. I think people need to understand that because they can apply it not just to history. It can be expanded to just all areas of human life. You could find this theorem very valuable and useful just as a citizen, for example.
And how has it been received so far?
Well, it's 4 out of 5 stars on Amazon with dozens of reviews, so that's good.
That's very good,
yeah. And also on all other, like Barnes and Noble and so on, it's getting good reviews. It hasn't, to my knowledge, gotten an academic review yet. I'm hoping it will, at least at the very least, so that it'll get some attention or press in the academic world. And I do know there are historians who have the book and are aware of it and so on and are reading it. So it's not being ignored, certainly. But there's a difference between people liking it and adopting it but then also going out of their way to write a review for a journal. A lot of people don't do that. So we'll wait and see. I mean, we got to wait for maybe a year before we'll see reviews appear. That tends to happen. I see usually for most academic books, it can be a year or even 2 years. In some cases, 3 or 4 before reviews start to appear in academic journals.
This is just out of personal curiosity or maybe public curiosity. What about stuff like blog posts or blog entries? Do those count at all, or you can't use that as for or against your case?
Actually, these days blogs count for a lot depending on who's writing them. So there are a lot of serious historians who write blogs and so on, and that can be influential and important. And so that's valuable for getting the word out and getting the book seen and read by more academics, certainly. But of course, it's more significant, I think, if we can get if an academic or a scholar or a historian gets a published one in one of the academic journals, because that's recognized as a more formal academic setting for that kind of thing.
Dr. Carey, have you read Bart Ehrman's latest book, Did Jesus Exist? And what is your opinion on it?
I guess you haven't been following that kerfuffle.
Well, actually, I have. I just wanted to. Some questions I have to ask just for formality.
Yeah, so of course I read it, and I found it disastrously terrible, and I wrote a blog saying as much. And then he responded, and then I responded, and so on. Later this month, and this is June, later this month I'm going to get a recap article out. And then start addressing some of the other aspects of the book, because one of the things I didn't talk about was his treatment of my work, which was very shallow and slipshod in many respects. And so I want to get back onto that. But I need to do a recap of where we are on this debate between Ehrman and myself. I think the biggest problem, though, is that he's basically sitting from the armchair and assumes that his position is correct, so he doesn't need to be detailed, he doesn't need to be careful, he doesn't need to take us as seriously as he claims we should be. And I think he's just sort of shooting from the hip and not being a careful scholar, not presenting a careful researched argument. It's kind of like the Achilles heel, because his work is usually so excellent. All his books prior to this, maybe I don't know about all of them, I haven't read all of them, but all the ones I have read are excellent books, and I still recommend them, like Jesus Interrupted, Forged, even Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, which is kind of a more advanced text. All of those I recommend to people as for what they represent to be. They're very good at doing their job. They're very well written, and they're generally right most of the time. For him to come out with this book was really a shock to me. I was really expecting it to be an excellent, like the best book ever done against the mythicist hypothesis, and I was really looking forward to it to be that, and it really isn't. In fact, it's so terrible that I'm bummed that I can't recommend it to people. Because I was hoping to be able to use it as a course text, for example, like say, look, if it's good enough, we'll use it as a course text, or then you can learn from it, and then we'll talk about where maybe some of the weaknesses of the argument are, and so on. But it's actually so bad that it's so misleading that you'll have more wrong information in your head by the end of reading it than you started with. So it's kind of like negative scholarship. This is the same problem I have with bad mythicist literature as well. Why, for example, I would recommend you never read The Jesus Mysteries by Freak and Gandhi. By the end of it, you're going to have way more false information in your head than you started with. So you're better off never having read it. And I find the same problem with Ehrman's book, which it's a shame.
What books would you recommend that, besides your book, I remember there's a speech where you say, outside of Richard Carrier, these are the books I recommend. What books from a mythicist point of view would you recommend?
Robert Price's latest, The Christ Myth Theory and Its Problems, is the best one from him. I don't agree with everything in it. I don't think he's right all the time, but it's at least a reasonable, cautious representation of the thesis. It's one of the better ones out there. It's not the best. And I think Doherty's The Jesus Puzzle is still the best available. And it's also not flawless, but it is the best one in print so far.
Which edition? Because there's a little one and there's a gigantic, ginormous one.
And I don't see those as two editions of the same book. They're very different books. They're organized differently and everything. The Jesus Puzzle, the original one, is far superior. The bigger one, the new one, Jesus Neither God Nor Man, is really kind of like a gigantic appendix to the first book. I know that's not how he intended it. That's not how he wrote it. He wrote it intending it to replace the first book. But I think the new book is worse in a lot of respects. And one of which is that it took a really tightly argued thesis and buries it under mountains and mountains of more questionable speculation and debate. And I think this is another thing that I think happens to scholars like Ehrman, is they'll read a book like that. We know about this documented cognitive bias, this error that our brains make, where if we see like 4 arguments for a conclusion, and 3 of them are weak and 1 of them is strong, we will assume the argument is weak, because we can easily defeat some of the arguments, and so we'll assume, our brains just automatically intuitively assume that the strong arguments must be as easily refutable. And we've actually, this has been documented in laboratory tests and so on, that if you take any argument, and you add a weak argument onto it. So for example, if you have a test subject and you give them a strong argument, and then you have another test subject and you give them the exact same argument, worded exactly the same way, but then you also add a weak one, the second person will have less confidence in the conclusion by the end of it. So that they're actually being argued out of the thesis by the mere presence of a weak argument, even though they're reading the exact same strong argument that the other subject is. And this, I think, Ehrman is falling victim to, because, and this is a problem with Doherty's new book, because there's so many weak arguments in there that are easily refuted or you can doubt them, that the good arguments get ignored by your brain. And so essentially that your reaction to having read it is, well, that was a bunch of really speculative stuff. I don't really know if that's a very strong case. Conversely, if you read Jesus Puzzle is very tightly argued. It sticks almost entirely to essential premises only. There are a few things in it which I think are excessively speculative or weak, but by and large, most of it is strongly argued, and it makes a much better case. If you read that book, you'll have a much better picture of the initial concept of the theory that can actually be defended. Even if you have some disagreements with them, it's still a much better defense. And so I find that is still the best book written in defense of the Jesus myth theory. Obviously, my next book I intend to be
the one.
The end-all, be-all. No, it won't be the end-all. But I'm deliberately trying to make it the best possible text to be written on this subject to date. I mean, I've been spending years refining it and perfecting it to really make it be that, because we need it, and no one else is writing it. So that leaves it up to me, basically.
We would definitely look forward to it. And if you were teaching a course and you had to give a book on the historicity of Jesus, since Ehrman is out, what book would you recommend to the layperson or your students?
Well, I'm going to teach a course in this July, an online course for Center for Inquiry Institute, which anyone can participate in. And it's going to be on the historicity theory, where I'll be doing pro and con. And I'll be using Proving History, my book Proving History, as the course text. But I'll be supplementing that with lectures provided to the students by me, basically written lectures and some videos and things. Right now, that's the most efficient way to do it. But if you want to just read up on like the best case for the existence of Jesus, what I would recommend is, it's Van Voorst's book, Jesus Outside the New Testament. That's a good one. It's a nice, tight, small book. He's not always right, but it's a decent scholarly work, and it's one of the best, surveys of the evidence for the existence of Jesus. The only thing it doesn't treat very extensively is what we can extract from the Gospels, which is a vexed question, and there's really nothing ideal for that. The best thing would be Ehrman's like Jesus Interrupted, for example, would be your best introduction to the New Testament and what we can derive from it. But that would be, I think, the best case for historicity. The only problem is, of course, that Jesus Interrupted doesn't interact at all with the rebuttals provided by mythicists. And one would have hoped that Did Jesus Exist would have done that, but it does a poor job of that, so it doesn't rise to the occasion. Another one, if you want something more extensive and meatier, is The Historical Jesus by Thyssen and Mertz. It's just called The Historical Jesus. Does it have a subtitle? Let me see here. Yeah, here it is. The Historical Jesus, A Comprehensive Guide. And that's a huge book. It's like almost 700 pages. Oh, no, 642 pages. And that covers everything. And it's a bit tedious. It's not superbly written. Of course, it's a translation of a German text. But it is, again, it's the most comprehensive and most sober scholarly attempt to argue for the historical existence of Jesus in print so far.
To finish off, Dr. Carrier, what advice do you have for lay people looking to find the most reasonable explanation or explanations for the genesis of Christianity? One of the examples you used, which I kind of went, was you say, avoid scholarship before 1950. So basically I have to throw out J.R.S. Mead's, but I can adopt Alvar Ellegard's Jesus 100 years before Christ, right? That's
there's a
no Adolf von Harnack.
The problem with Ellegard, of course, is that he's not his qualifications are not up to par. He's not 100% reliable, but he does make an interesting case, and the documents he discusses do exist. At least they're not fictional, and so he's one of the examples of making a decent case for that alternate hypothesis. But there isn't really anyone who's treated that particular evidence in a way that I would recommend people read, unfortunately. But yeah, the problem with the 1950, and that's somewhat arbitrary, 1950, but it's just, there are certain reasons why. I wrote a blog about it, History Before 1950, which you could Google, probably find, explaining why the cutoff is in 1950. It's just after that, methods got better, and before that, methods sucked. So you have a lot of the work before 1950 is you can't tell what you're reading whether it's reliably researched or not, or oftentimes you can't tell how well they checked their facts, for example, or and also it's written in a context where we lacked a lot of background knowledge. After 1950, we started to acquire a great deal more understanding of the ancient world, of things like the sociology and anthropology of religion, and a variety of other contexts, basically cultural understanding and economic understanding and things like that, that change the way we see evidence and reach conclusions about the ancient world. So history after 1950 tends to be far superior. Now, that doesn't mean all history after 1950 is reliable. It's just better than the stuff before. And so you have to be judicious. In Chapter 2, Proving History, I kind of give some, basically describe what makes for good history versus bad, and it's kind of like a little guide for laymen to kind of tell, this is how you tell, a good historian from a bad historian, and how to weigh arguments. But generally, when you see good arguments for two different positions, two contradictory positions in history, as a layman, oftentimes you can't really adjudicate between them unless those arguments are so clearly made, so the evidence is very clear and the inferences are very clear, so that the layman can see who's making a logically valid argument and who's not. And I think it's our responsibility as historians to make our case in that form, so that even a layman can look at our argument and say, well, if these facts are correct, and he's done a really good job of researching them, and these conclusions do correctly, logically, validly follow from those facts. And then they go and look at the critics and say, well, do the critics challenge his evidence? Or what do the critics say? And then you can just compare and contrast. Like, who's got... what is the evidence? Figure that out first. And, the debate between scholars will give you an idea. And then work out who's making logically valid arguments, whose conclusions logically validly follow from their evidence. And that's something that laymen can do. That's a skill that you can learn without being a professional historian. You're just relying on historians' expertise in certain broad judgments about general possibilities and probabilities and things like that. But even then, when you're looking at the debate, you can tell who's agreeing with what subjects. For example, I can make a number of assertions about the ancient world, and then you can look at my critics and say, do they even challenge any of those? And they probably won't in many cases, or they'll even agree with them. And so when you look where the agreement is or where the disagreements aren't, and then you can use that information to sort of assess which historian is probably right. And I think that there are ways for laymen to do that. And I think maybe in future I might write a blog about how laymen can take advantage of these skills to try and assess situations in debates like this, because there are ones like the Holocaust debate, like Holocaust denial. If you're a layman, how do you approach that debate? I mean, you could just say, well, Holocaust deniers are a fringe group. Most historians say that, and therefore I'll just trust the majority. Sometimes, though, the majority is wrong. And so you do need to be a little bit more skeptical of that, or at least have the skills to tell if the consensus is well-founded. And I think, in the case of the Holocaust, obviously, if you do even even the most trivial research, you can very quickly find that Holocaust deniers are full of shit. That's an easy one for laymen. But when you get to more complicated issues like the history of why the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there are different competing historical theories as to how much we knew and when about Pearl Harbor, for example, and things like that that are a lot more complicated. But I still think if historians do their job and argue coherently and clearly in a certain way, I think laymen can still evaluate and figure out which side is right in debates like that.
Well, great words of wisdom. And for those who might not be familiar with your work, you're kind of like the Freddy Krueger. You're everywhere on the internet. What did you tell the listener? Do you have a hub website where they can find information on you?
Yes, richardcarrier.info, INFO. So basically my name, all is one word, .info. And that's my hub. You can learn everything about me and all my work there. My blog is linked from there. My Amazon store is linked from there, where I have recommended readings for the origins. If you want to study the origins of Christianity, if you want to study philosophy, I have lists of recommended readings in there. Plus all of my work is in there and so on. So you can learn all about me from there.
Well, wonderful. Well, I think that's all the time we have today, Dr. Carrier. I'd like to thank you very much for coming on Aeon Byte and discussing your book, Proving History. And I hope it does very well, and we certainly look forward to your next book.
Yeah, I hope so. I'm really excited by it. I was redoing some drafts just this week, and I want it to be published.
Yeah, so do we.
I like this chapter. This chapter's ready. Yeah, excellent.
And there you have it, my beloved truth seekers. Richard Carrier on a Shock the Monkey interview concerning the quest for the historical Christ. All based on his latest blasphemy, Proving History, Bayes' Theorem, and the quest for the historical Jesus. I was a mythicist before I started reading his work years ago. Now I'm a mythicist 2.0, or something droll like that. Dr. Carrier is also the author of Not the Impossible Faith, Sense and Goodness Without God, and Why I'm Not a Christian. And certainly check out his website, richardcarrier with 2 R's.info. Other than that, here's some of my evangelist pleading. Donations or any type of assistance are always an infernal blessing, even if it's the many skills I don't have, like web design or just helping out with a YouTube page. We are just one of many Hobbit podcasters trying to throw the rings of ignorance and intolerance into the molten hot mess that is the mainstream media. Don't feed those media trolls anymore. Your support is essential for Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio. Thank you for those who have buttressed this venture via donations, buying products like Stargazer or Voices of Gnosticism, or downloading past episodes from our archive of past shows. It's the greatest resource on the internet for Gnosticism, the esoterica, and free thought. But more help is necessary if this venture is to continue at this or any level. If everyone simply donates a shekel or buys a show every week, I can break even and maybe even finish my project of making my own personal human centipede. Again, your support is essential. Damning your soul has never been this cheap. And please spread the heretical word about this podcast to anyone seeking the road less traveled or the highway to hell. This venture is indeed completely non-profit. We just want to keep the lights here on at Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio. We shall end your suffering with some tunes from my friend Errol Eisel and his band Sylvia Bliss, who are the force behind the Real Horror Show CDs, Muse of Fire, and the brand new Toad's Tongue and Arsenic Part 1. really talented progressive rock with Gnostic and occult overtones and undertones and every tone under the sun, even though the sun is eclipsed by the moon. The song is Babalu I. Check them out at Amazon.com and other outlets. That is Sylvia Bliss. That's all I got this incarnation, my beloved True Seekers. I am in your eternal debt for visiting the solar logos in his little inner sanctum of gnosis, somewhere in the outer rectums of reality. Thank you and come again. Oh, Hecate, how about a little Gospel of Philip? If anyone becomes a son of the bridal chamber, he will receive the light. If anyone does not receive it while he is here, he will not be able to receive it in the other place. He who will receive that light will not be seen, nor can he be detained. And none shall be able to torment a person like this, even while he dwells in the world. And again, when he leaves the world, he has already received the truth in the images. The world has become the Aeon, the eternal realm, for the Aeon is fullness for him. This is the way it is. It is revealed to him alone, not hidden in the darkness and the night, but hidden in a perfect day and a holy light. I am Abraxas, broadcasting at the virtual Alexandria through the God Above God Dad Can. The road is ended, the song is over, thought I'd have something more to say. But don't cultivate any troubles, my beloved True Seekers, because like heaven above you, the spy that loved you, I'm keeping all of your secrets safe with me tonight. Again, this is Sylvia Bliss, and their song is Babalu I, from the CD, Muse of Fire. Hello, and goodbye as always.